Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
The room was too bright. That sterile, humming kind of bright that makes your eyes ache after 5 minutes. I sat in the chair across from Lindsay Mallory, Director of Human Resources at Benson Tech, a woman whose handshake was colder than the air conditioning in that office. She had one of those polite smiles people wear when they think they've already won. The kind of smile that says, "This isn't personal," while they slowly shove the knife in. She slid the letter across the polished table like it was a damn appetizer menu. "We appreciate your years of service, Mark, truly, but the company's restructuring, and unfortunately your position is being eliminated." She folded her hands. "You'll land on your feet." I smiled, not because I believed her. I smiled because I didn't want to give her the satisfaction. I folded the letter once, twice, tucked it into the inner pocket of my jacket like it was some sacred text, and stood up. Didn't say a word, just walked out. But here's the thing she didn't expect. She thought she'd just ended my career. She had no clue she'd just jump-started the best chapter of my life. See, Lindsay was good at HR, no doubt. She could manage a paper trail like a magician. Knew every legal term that could keep a company's ass covered and yours hanging out to dry. But she made one mistake. She thought I was a nobody. A middle-aged guy who didn't post on LinkedIn, didn't network over bottomless brunches, didn't have hustle in his bones. What she didn't know was that I'd been playing a long game, even if I didn't know it yet. I walked out of that building on a Friday afternoon with a cardboard box full of memories, family pictures, a novelty mug that said, "I'm not arguing, I'm just explaining why I'm right," and a hard drive full of presentations that I'd stayed up nights working on, only to have someone else's name slapped on the final product. I got into my 10-year-old Ford, stared at the wheel for a minute, and laughed. One of those bitter, tight-chested laughs. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. 11 years. That's how long I'd given to Benson Tech. I'd been there when they were still operating out of a building with water-stained ceiling tiles and dial-up internet. I stayed when better offers came because I believed in what we were building. And now, some Ivy League shark in a tie who couldn't write a line of code if you handed him a manual decided that I was redundant. Sure, redundant. You know what really burned? It wasn't the firing. That was just the result. What burned was how they did it. No warning, no heads up, just a vague calendar invite titled HR Check-In. Like I was too dumb to know what was coming. No one even had the decency to look me in the eye except Lindsay, and even she was playing a role. Cool, collected, corporate. God, I used to joke that if Lindsay ever bled, it'd be toner. On the ride home, I didn't blast music like in the movies. I didn't scream into the steering wheel. I drove in silence, let every shitty memory of the last few months play on repeat. The Monday meetings where my suggestions were met with nods, then rephrased by someone younger, flashier, with better hair, and suddenly it was genius. The emails that went unanswered. The one-on-one with my manager, Carl Weston, where he told me I should let the younger guys take more ownership. As if I hadn't carried their dead weight through 3 product launches, the signs were there. I was just too damn tired to read them. You ever get that feeling? That gnawing twist in your gut when you realize you've been loyal to people who saw you as disposable? That you missed birthdays, worked weekends, skipped anniversaries. For what? A polite pat on the back and a termination letter? Be honest. Have you ever dreamed of walking back into your old job as the boss? What would you say to the person who fired you? Would you smile like I did, or would you flip the damn table? The worst part wasn't the firing. It was going home and telling my wife. Lucy took one look at me when I walked through the door and knew. She didn't cry. She just exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. Maybe she had. We sat in the kitchen, the light flickering above us because I still hadn't replaced the bulb, and I told her everything. Every humiliating detail. She held my hand and said the words I needed to hear. "You didn't do anything wrong." But I didn't believe it. Not yet. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. I kept waiting for the anger to hit, but it didn't. Just a slow, thick fog of disbelief. I kept checking my phone, half expecting an apology call. A mistake. We'll find another place for you. Nothing. The world had moved on, and I was yesterday's news, except I wasn't done. Because somewhere between the third rejection email and the moment I saw our old VP announce the upcoming merger on a podcast, something clicked. A switch flipped, and I realized something Lindsay Mallory and Carl Weston had completely underestimated. I knew things, not secrets, not gossip, real things, numbers, patterns, the kind of insights that don't show up in quarterly reports. And more than that, I had time now. Time and motivation, a dangerous combo. So I started planning. Slowly, quietly. No social media rants, no dramatic gestures. Just focus. Because you can't build a comeback if you're too busy playing the victim. And make no mistake, I wasn't interested in getting even. I wanted the kind of win that couldn't be denied, the kind where they see your name, hear your voice, and realize too late they fired the wrong damn guy. The first time I met Dale Weston, he was carrying a Starbucks in one hand and his own ego in the other. He had that kind of smile that people in sales wear like a tailored suit, artificially polished and absolutely meaningless. Dale wasn't hired because he was competent. He was hired because he looked the part. Strong handshake, great teeth, MBA from somewhere expensive, and an uncanny ability to repeat what you just said back to you while pretending it was his idea. He had the kind of career built not on skill, but on staying just useful enough to avoid scrutiny and just likable enough to never eat lunch alone. In a room full of thinkers, he was a talker, but he knew how to climb. I remember sitting in meetings where I'd lay out a strategy, detailed, data-backed, precise, and Dale would nod along as if he were genuinely absorbing every word. Then he'd turn around and, in the next executive session, present that same strategy as something he and his core team had brainstormed. His core team didn't exist. It was me, but I wasn't in that room. I wasn't invited to that room. And eventually, you get tired of watching someone else cash the checks written with your ideas. Lindsay Mallory, the HR lady with the cold eyes and even colder heart, was always around during those years. She was like a piece of expensive office furniture, always perfectly placed, immovable, and slightly intimidating. She wasn't evil, at least not in the way villains are in movies. She was worse. She was practical, efficient, the kind of person who didn't stab you in the back out of malice but out of policy. If the data pointed to you being a problem, you became one. And once you became a problem, Lindsay solved it. Quietly, legally, permanently. I spent years thinking I was valuable because I worked hard, because I stayed late, because I said yes when everyone else said no. But the truth is, in a place like Benson Tech, value wasn't measured in dedication. It was measured in visibility. And I had made the fatal mistake of believing that substance mattered more than style. I was wrong. The beginning of the end came during the Raven project. It was supposed to be our game changer, a new platform that could streamline internal logistics for mid-sized manufacturers. I built the framework myself, spent 4 months stitching together the tech infrastructure while managing a junior team that was half-trained and overstressed. Dale showed up to 2 meetings, gave a few vague suggestions, and spent the rest of the time in stakeholder alignment sessions, which I'm convinced was just code for golfing with vendors. Then, one Monday morning, I walked in to find my access to the development environment revoked. No warning, no explanation. Just a terse email from Lindsay saying, "We're rotating leadership on Raven for optimal synergy." That was her actual phrasing, optimal synergy. I sat at my desk staring at the screen, knowing full well what had happened. Dale had taken the project, my project, and he'd done it in a way that was clean, quiet, and irreversible. When I tried to question it, Carl, the director of product, shrugged and told me, "Sometimes we need fresh eyes." He didn't even look at me when he said it. It wasn't long after that when the slow freeze began. Invitations stopped arriving in my inbox. Meetings got moved without me. I became invisible, except when something went wrong. Then I was front and center, the convenient scapegoat. One day, I overheard Dale telling a new hire that he'd pioneered Raven from the ground up. I sat in the break room with a cup of lukewarm coffee, listening to him rewrite history with the kind of confidence only someone completely immune to shame could manage. But the real kick in the teeth came one night when I was cleaning out some old files on my company drive. I found an email chain that had been accidentally forwarded to me months earlier. It had been buried under a thread about parking passes. At first, I didn't think much of it. The subject line was vague, RE Q3 realignments. But when I opened it, there it was in black and white, an internal discussion between Dale, Lindsay, and Carl, dated nearly 3 months before I was let go. They'd been planning my exit all along, not because I failed, not because I wasn't performing, but because, as Carl put it, Mark's style doesn't scale with the new vision. He's better suited for a legacy environment. Legacy environment. That was corporate speak for old, too old to be trendy, too slow to be disruptive, too principled to play dirty. I sat there staring at that email for what felt like hours. My hands were shaking, not with anger, but with something deeper. Betrayal. It wasn't just about losing a job, it was about losing your place in the story you helped write. They'd used me, drained me dry, and tossed me out like an expired printer cartridge. But that email, that little digital breadcrumb, was something they hadn't intended for me to see. It was a glimpse behind the curtain, proof that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't imagined the backstabbing. They really had conspired to cut me loose. I didn't print it. I didn't forward it. I just saved it to an encrypted folder and backed it up twice. Not because I knew what I was going to do with it, but because somewhere deep in my gut I sensed that one day it might matter. One day I might need it, not to get even, but to remember. Because this wasn't the end, not even close. Dale and Lindsay thought they'd written the final chapter of my story, but what they didn't know was that I'd just started reading theirs. And the longer I looked, the more cracks I began to see. This wasn't going to be a tantrum, it was going to be a strategy. They played chess, I was learning how to play the board, and the best part, they still thought I was out of the game. There's something humiliating about unemployment that no one talks about, at least not out loud. It's not just the lack of income or the creeping panic that settles in around the second week. It's the sudden shift in how the world looks at you. One day, you're respected, useful, maybe even important. The next, you're just a guy with too much time on his hands and a resume that doesn't get replies. People start talking slower, as if you've forgotten how to understand basic conversation. Friends who used to ask for your opinion suddenly start offering you advice you didn't ask for. You begin to feel like a broken appliance someone left on the curb with a note. Still works? Mostly. In the first week, I was still in denial. I updated my LinkedIn profile with all the corporate optimism I could muster. Exploring new opportunities, excited for the next chapter, ready to bring my skills to a new team. It was all lies, of course. What I really wanted to write was, just got stabbed in the back by a bunch of suits who couldn't lead a team of squirrels through a park. But that doesn't get you recruiters. So I smiled in the photo, typed the buzzwords, and pretended I wasn't bitter. The second week, I started the job search in earnest. I spent hours tweaking cover letters, tailoring each application to match the exact language of the job postings. I was meticulous. I was professional. I was completely ignored. Rejections came fast and impersonal. Some within minutes. Others didn't come at all. And in between the silences, I got those dreaded phrases no one over 45 wants to hear. You're overqualified. We're looking for someone with a more contemporary background. And my favorite, we went with someone who aligns better with our current culture. Culture. That was the polite way of saying I was too experienced, too expensive, and too much of a reminder of how far the company had drifted from actual competence. By the third week, things got dark. Not dramatic, movie script dark. Just the slow, draining kind of darkness that seeps into your bones. My sleep got weird. I started drinking too much coffee in the morning and too much whiskey at night. I sat in my home office, staring at the monitor, watching the cursor blink like it was judging me. Lucy tried to be supportive, bless her. She kept the tone gentle, the questions light. But I could see the worry behind her eyes. She was doing the math in her head, just like I was. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance, all those years of stability gone in a single meeting. And for what? So Dale Weston could consolidate power and Lindsay could pad her exit strategy with another clean termination. Then, like most bad things, rock bottom didn't knock. It barged in. I got a call from my old college buddy Rick, who I hadn't seen in years. He'd moved out of state and worked in private equity now, whatever that really meant. We caught up briefly, small talk, surface level stuff, and then he said, "Hey, random question, weren't you at Benson Tech until recently?" I told him, yeah, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. He paused, then said, "You know they're about to get acquired, right?" I sat up straighter in my chair. That was the first I'd heard of it. No press releases, no leaks on the usual forums, nothing. Rick explained that his firm had been hearing whispers, something about a quiet acquisition by a holding group based out of Chicago. It wasn't public yet, but it was coming. And if it went through, it would mean a complete overhaul of executive leadership, potential stock shifts, and likely a massive restructuring of personnel. I hung up the phone and just sat there, replaying the conversation in my head. I thought back to all the little things, the sudden reassignments, the management shuffle, the radio silence from the upper floors. It all made sense now. They weren't just restructuring, they were cleaning house in preparation for a sale. And I, the loyal employee who knew too much, had been inconvenient. Easier to let me go and paint it as a budget cut than risk me being around when the real decisions started rolling in. But here's where things get interesting. Because I wasn't just any employee. I had built the back-end infrastructure for over half of Benson Tech's product systems. I knew the data flows, the process bottlenecks, the hidden bugs in their reporting software. I knew where the tech was fragile and where it had been duct-taped together with last-minute code from overworked engineers. In other words, I knew exactly what the acquiring firm didn't. And that gave me leverage. Maybe not legally actionable leverage, but strategic, quiet, devastating leverage. So I started digging. I pulled out my old backups, the documents I'd saved, the analytics reports I had authored over the years. I reviewed architecture plans, support tickets, and departmental assessments that had never been sent upstream. I didn't do anything illegal, no proprietary theft, no company secrets leaked, but I built a profile, a picture of what Benson Tech really looked like behind the glossy marketing slides. Then, once I had it organized, I called Rick back and asked him a simple question. Would your firm be interested in a consultant who knows the inside anatomy of their next acquisition? The silence on the line told me everything I needed to know. What started as a desperation move quickly became something else. Rick put me in touch with one of their partners, a guy named Lewis, who asked sharp questions and listened more than he talked. Within days, I had a non-disclosure agreement signed, and a quiet, paid consulting gig slipped into my inbox. Nothing permanent, just technical advisory support during transition assessment. But I knew what it meant. I wasn't just back in the game, I was in the room now. And this time, I wasn't the guy building the foundation. I was the guy watching it shift. There's a certain pleasure in moving silently through the chaos of people who once dismissed you, watching them stumble over themselves in meetings, scrambling to predict outcomes they don't even know are coming, while you sit back and sip your coffee, knowing more than they could imagine. It doesn't come with fireworks or applause. It's quieter than that. It's the smirk you hide behind a neutral expression, the raised eyebrow when someone pitches an idea you already know will get vetoed by a board they haven't even met. That's what it felt like when I stepped back into Benson Tech, not as an employee, but as a consultant for the private equity firm preparing to acquire it. They didn't know I was coming. And when they saw me walk into the glass meeting room on the 23rd floor, their confusion was delicious. The first person I locked eyes with was Dale Weston, who tried to play it cool, but failed miserably. His expression shifted from confident to confused in the span of a heartbeat, and for a split second, He looked like a man who had just realized the life raft he was clinging to had a slow leak. Lindsay Mallory wasn't in the room yet, but I knew that would be the real moment. Her reaction wasn't going to be confusion, it would be calculation, because that's who she was. But Dale, despite his years of posturing and pretending to be the smartest man in the room, had never developed that particular skill. He was still stuck on that Monday morning mindset, believing that titles made you untouchable. What he didn't realize was that titles change hands faster than trust. My official role was non-invasive. I wasn't there to fire anyone, assign performance reviews, or approve budgets. I was, as the email had said, a temporary strategic resource. The language was vague by design, and intentionally so, because in rooms like these, clarity is a weapon, and ambiguity is a shield. I knew what I was really doing. I was watching, evaluating, taking notes on how the leadership team handled themselves under the pressure of scrutiny, which departments had their numbers in order, and which ones were bloated beyond reason. More importantly, I was feeding that information upward to people who were quietly deciding the future of the company. At first, they tried to ignore me. Dale kept his smiles tight and his tone overly professional, pretending like my presence didn't bother him. But I could see it eating at him. Every time I asked a question that cut a little too close to a weak point in his department's reports, he would shift in his seat, glance at Carl for backup, and then default to buzzwords. He tried to bury his nervousness under layers of jargon, but jargon doesn't stop numbers from bleeding. Lindsay finally entered the picture during the third week of transition meetings. She walked in with that same rigid poise she always carried, her folder tucked under one arm, her tablet already glowing with preloaded charts and legal outlines. She spotted me instantly, but to her credit, didn't flinch. No dramatic reaction, no frozen stare, just a slight tightening at the corners of her mouth, like a poker player who'd just drawn a bad hand and knew the pot was too big to fold. She took a seat opposite me, opened her tablet, and didn't say a word. That was the most dangerous part about Lindsay. She never gave you what you wanted. You had to earn every flinch, every pause, every blink. Over the next few days, the tension thickened. The acquisition process was moving quickly, and the real evaluations were beginning. Not just spreadsheets and performance metrics, but behavioral reviews, cross-department cooperation audits, and leadership effectiveness scoring. These were the soft metrics that don't show up on dashboards but matter deeply to investors who've seen too many glossy companies rot from the top down. Dale was failing them in real time, and he didn't even know it. His leadership, when stripped of his PowerPoint bravado, was hollow. The team under him was disengaged, overworked, and quietly hostile. And Lindsay, for all her procedural perfection, had built a compliance machine so focused on policy that it had forgotten about people. The human part of human resources was buried under flowcharts and CYA documentation. I had access to the investor calls now. I was part of the background noise, the name buried under bullet points in board slide decks. But my notes were shaping decisions. When Lewis, the partner at the investment firm, asked me to give an off-the-record assessment of the current leadership structure, I didn't pull punches. I told him plainly that the company was strong on paper, but brittle in practice. I told him that Dale was a liability masked as an asset, that his numbers were inflated by short-term moves that would collapse under new KPIs. And Lindsay, I said, was a brilliant tactician who'd forgotten the war wasn't just about compliance. It was about trust, morale, humanity, the stuff that can't be graphed. Louis listened carefully. He always did. And then he asked the question I didn't expect so soon. If we restructure post-acquisition, would you consider stepping in more formally? I paused, not for effect, but because the idea hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I'd been so focused on the quiet revenge, the slow return, the pleasure of being the ghost in the machine, that I hadn't really asked myself what I wanted next. I didn't want Dale's job. I didn't want Lindsay's either, but I wanted something more than a consulting badge. I wanted to be at the table, not for ego, for permanence. So I said yes with a caveat. I won't do it if I have to play by their rules. Lewis smiled on the other end of the call and said, "That's exactly why we're asking you." By the time the final acquisition agreement was drafted, I had already signed a long-term leadership contract. Not flashy, not loud, but with enough authority to make changes that mattered, and my name, quietly but unmistakably, was placed on the new org chart. Above Lindsay, above Dale. The irony was thick. They hadn't just fired me, they'd cleared the way. And now I was walking back in, not as a returning employee seeking redemption, but as the man they were going to answer to. The company town hall was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 10, the kind of time slot that made it feel important enough to demand attention, but not so critical as to ruin anyone's lunch. They sent out the calendar invite with the usual boilerplate language. Exciting updates, strategic growth, new chapter of leadership, phrases that corporate types use when they're about to rip out the old wiring and install a brand new fuse box, with or without your permission. The auditorium buzzed with speculation, some hopeful, others nervous, and many just trying to calculate whether they were going to be mentioned by name or left out entirely, which in times like these could go either way. I stood behind the black velvet curtain off stage, my notes folded neatly in the inner pocket of a jacket I hadn't worn since my last promotion at Benson Tech, back when I still thought loyalty was a two-way street and long hours led to long careers. Now I knew better. I'd spent the past month dismantling the illusion from the inside, piece by piece, until the people who once held the reins realized too late that they weren't even on the horse anymore. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't smug either. I was something else entirely. Centered, focused, maybe even dangerous, but in the way a sharp blade left on the table is dangerous. Still, silent, always just an inch away from being picked up. They called my name. I stepped out. For a moment, the room didn't react, not fully. A handful of people recognized me immediately. Their faces told the story better than any speech could. Eyes widened, posture stiffened, the quiet shuffle of backs straightening and whispers dying mid-sentence. Then came the slow realization that, yes, I was not a guest, not a fluke, not a nostalgic cameo. I was here with purpose, and I was holding the mic. I spoke plainly. No theatrics, no villain monologue, just the facts. I told them what was happening, that the acquisition was complete, that the new leadership structure would prioritize transparency, sustainability, and internal accountability. I avoided the language of vengeance, even though I felt every bit of it under my skin. I did not name names, did not call out Dale or Lindsay or Carl, because this wasn't their public humiliation. This was mine to own. I wasn't there to remind people I'd been wronged. I was there to show them that being underestimated doesn't mean being powerless. It just means being patient. After the applause, after the catered boxed lunches were passed around, after the crowd thinned into smaller groups for departmental breakout sessions, I made my way back upstairs. The executive floor hadn't changed much. Same glass walls, same whiteboards half erased with strategy diagrams from meetings no one remembered. Lindsay's office was still where it had been. She was inside, seated, the door open just enough to suggest she was waiting, maybe not for me, but certainly for something. She didn't stand when I entered. That was her way of keeping control, of pretending the moment didn't carry weight. I closed the door behind me, not because it was necessary, but because we both knew this conversation wasn't for hallway ears. "You're not going to fire me," she said, like she was stating the weather. "No," I replied, I'm not. She leaned back, the slightest twitch of a smirk forming. Pity, it would have made for a cleaner story. I took the seat across from her, uninvited. Clean stories are for people who don't know the truth. We sat in silence for a long beat. Two people who had known each other too well for too long to pretend that civility was anything but camouflage. Lindsay was sharp, cold, calculating, and I had no illusions about what she would do if the tables were turned. But I didn't come here to mirror her. I came here to decide what kind of man I wanted to be now that I had the leverage. "I'm promoting you," I said. and I watched her face flicker, the micro-expression she couldn't quite suppress, a mixture of disbelief and suspicion that passed like a shadow. "To what?" she asked, voice low. "Director of Compliance and Risk Management. New role, reports to the board, not me. No direct reports, no team, but full accountability on every procedural decision made in the last 5 years and everyone going forward." Her eyes narrowed. "You're sidelining me." "No," I said, smiling without showing teeth. "I'm giving you exactly what you wanted. Control over the rules, but no power over people." She looked away then, not out of defeat, but calculation. She was already reviewing angles, contingency plans, ways to spin this. I respected her for that. She'd survive, because that's what people like her do. But she'd do it in a corner, not a throne. And she'd know, every single day, who put her there. I stood to leave. Before I reached the door, she asked the question I knew was coming. "Was this always the plan?" I paused, one hand on the knob. "No," I said. "At first I just wanted to prove you wrong. Then I wanted to win. Now, I just want to build something that doesn't eat people alive." She didn't respond. She didn't have to. Back in my new office, I sat down at a desk that didn't yet feel like mine. I looked out over the city and thought about the absurdity of it all. That a man could be discarded, like yesterday's lunch, and come back as the one holding the knife and fork. I had done the impossible, at least by corporate standards, but as the hours passed and the emails piled in and the meetings began to stack on my calendar, I realized that revenge, real revenge, is never just about triumph. It's about transformation. The voicemail came in late that evening, just as I was packing up. It was from a company bigger than Benson Tech, a firm I'd once dreamed of joining back when I was still chasing titles and plaques on doors. They wanted to talk about a position, a global strategy role, big salary, bigger scope. I didn't call back, not yet, because as satisfying as it would be to walk away again, this time on my terms, I hadn't decided what kind of man I was going to be. The one who burns it all down? Or the one who stays behind and builds something better out of the ash? I don't know. What I do know is that Lindsay once told me I'd land on my feet. She just didn't expect those feet to be on her office rug, calmly deciding the future while she sat across from me, wondering when exactly the ground had shifted. And the truth is, I didn't expect it either. But here we are.